Welcome back to Shadow of Empires. If you've watched our previous videos on Pompey's forbidden desires, you've seen how social transgression operates, how desire crosses boundaries, how people risk everything to violate rules. But today's story reveals something far darker, something that wasn't transgression at all, something that was systematic, organized, officially sanctioned, something that affected millions of people across centuries. Something that left a genetic fingerprint visible in the DNA of hundreds of millions of people alive today. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, we're exposing a conspiracy so vast, so carefully hidden, that it touches the bloodline of nearly everyone on Earth. We're investigating the secret history of royal families and the methods they use to maintain control of their own dynasties. Methods involving murder, manipulation, and the deliberate cultivation of illegitimate heirs as a strategy for power. But first, you need to understand what happened when the Mongol Empire swept across Asia and into Europe. What happened when the most brutal military force the world had ever seen took control of cities and civilizations. What happened when conquerors decided that their right extended not just to land and wealth, but to the bodies of the conquered people. It was the 13th century, the age of conquest. The Mongol Empire was expanding at a rate unprecedented in human history. Genghis Khan, the man who would create the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, had united the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. He had created an army that operated with discipline and efficiency that was revolutionary for its time. He had developed military strategies that allowed relatively small forces to conquer vastly larger populations. He had created a system of terror that made resistance seem futile. By the time of his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire controlled more territory than any single entity had controlled before. But Genghis Khan was just the beginning. His successors expanded the empire even further. His grandsons, Monk Khan, Kublai Khan, and others extended Mongol control across Asia, into the Middle East, into Eastern Europe. At its height, the Mongol Empire covered more than 9 million square miles. It stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It encompassed dozens of different ethnic groups and hundreds of different cultures and religions. It was, in terms of sheer geographic scope, the largest empire the world had ever seen. And it was built on violence, on systematic, organized, deliberate violence. The Mongols didn't conquer through negotiation or trade. They conquered through fear. Cities that resisted were obliterated. Populations that refused to submit were massacred. The Mongols developed a reputation so terrifying that many cities surrendered without a fight, simply because they knew what would happen if they didn't. But conquest wasn't just about military victory. It was also about control, about ensuring that conquered populations remained subjugated, about making sure that the conquered peoples understood their place in the hierarchy, about establishing systems that would maintain Mongol dominance across generations. And one of the ways the Mongol Khans maintained control was through what historians have delicately called the right of the first night. But this wasn't a quaint medieval tradition. This wasn't some ceremonial practice that happened rarely. This was systematic. This was organized. This was a deliberate policy implemented across the Mongol Empire for centuries. The practice worked like this. When a city was conquered, particularly when it was conquered by force, the Mongol Khan or his representatives would select women from the conquered population, young women of marriageable age. Women who were virgins. The selections were sometimes made from the general population. Sometimes they were targeted at the families of local leaders or nobility, ensuring that the humiliation was inflicted on those who had held power before the conquest. These women were then brought to the Khan's quarters, or to whatever represented the Khan's residence in that particular city, and they were forced into sexual relations with the Khan or his representatives. This wasn't rape in the technical sense, because the conquered women had no legal standing to refuse. They were property. They were spoils of war. The Khan's right to use them was absolute. The purpose was multifaceted. On one level, it was the assertion of absolute power. The Khan was demonstrating that his authority extended to everything, that he controlled not just the land and the wealth, but the very bodies of the conquered people, that there was nothing sacred, nothing protected, that the conquest was total and complete. On another level, it served a practical purpose. The women who were selected were often from the most prominent families or the most beautiful girls. By forcing relations with the Khan, the Mongols were ensuring that the most beautiful women of the conquered population would bear the Khan's children. This meant that the resulting children would have both the genetic legacy of the conquered population and the genetic legacy of the Mongol ruling class. It meant that there would be a biological connection between the rulers and the ruled. But here's where it gets particularly dark. These weren't one-time occurrences. These women, having been forced into relations with the Khan, would often become pregnant. And when they did, they were essentially trapped. They were now bearing the Khan's child. They couldn't return to their previous lives. They couldn't marry men of their own people. They were now marked as the property of the Khan. If they were lucky, they might be given to a Mongol officer as a concubine. If they were unlucky, they were simply discarded after serving their purpose. The children born from these forced encounters occupied an interesting position in Mongol society. They were half Mongol, half local. They were never fully accepted by the Mongol elite, but they were also superior to the full local population. They had the blood of the conquerors in their veins. Some of these children were raised in the Khan's household and trained for positions of authority. Others were sent back to their mothers' communities, where they served as living reminders of the conquest. The scale of this practice was staggering. Across the Mongol Empire, across dozens of cities and regions, across generations of Khans, this practice continued for centuries. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of women, possibly millions. The sheer numbers beggar the imagination. But for most of history, there was no way to prove it. It was part of the historical record, certainly. Chroniclers from conquered cities mentioned it. Historians noted it. But it was always presented as something distant, something that happened to other people, something that could be debated and discussed academically without fully confronting the reality of what it meant. Until, that is, DNA analysis became possible. In the early 2000s, geneticists began to notice something remarkable, a genetic signature that appeared in men across a vast geographic area, a signature that suggested descent from a single male ancestor. A genetic pattern that was so common, so widespread, that it could only be explained if a single man had fathered an enormous number of children across a huge geographic area over a relatively short period of time. The geneticists initially assumed there must be an error. The numbers didn't make sense, but they kept analyzing. They kept checking their data, and the pattern kept emerging. A Y chromosome signature that appeared in approximately 0.5% of the global male population. That's approximately 16 million men alive today who carry this genetic signature. Further analysis narrowed down the geographic origin. The signature was most common in Central Asia. It was present in high concentrations in Mongolia, Kazakhstan, and the surrounding regions. It was present in lower but still significant concentrations across the Middle East, into the Caucasus, into Eastern Europe. The geographic distribution exactly matched the extent of the Mongol Empire at its height. Then came the historical analysis. Researchers looked at the timeline. When had this single male ancestor lived? Based on mutation rates and genetic diversity, the analysis suggested he had lived approximately 1,000 years ago, plus or minus a century or two, which meant he had lived right during the time of Genghis Khan, right during the height of the Mongol conquests. The conclusion was inescapable. The genetic signature matched Genghis Khan, or more specifically, it matched someone from Genghis Khan's line, someone who had fathered an enormous number of children across a vast geographic area during the period of Mongol expansion. But here's where it gets even more interesting. Subsequent studies have identified multiple genetic signatures, not just one, but several. Multiple Y chromosome patterns that appear in unusually high frequencies across populations that were conquered by the Mongols. Multiple male ancestors. Multiple Khans and generals who had fathered large numbers of children across conquered populations. Mongolian Prince Mongol Khan, his brother Kublai Khan, various other Khans and military leaders. Each one of them showed the same pattern, a genetic signature that suggested they had fathered thousands of children across the conquered territories. The most extensive research on this phenomenon was conducted by geneticist Mark Jobling and his team at the University of Leicester. They sequenced Y chromosomes from men across Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. They identified the genetic signatures. They traced them back to their most likely origins, and they estimated that collectively Genghis Khan and his close male relatives had fathered at least tens of thousands of children, possibly hundreds of thousands. But here's the thing that makes this particularly significant. These weren't just children born from willing relationships. These were largely children born from forced encounters, from the rape of conquered women. The genetic evidence is a record of systematic sexual violence. It's a genetic map of conquest written in the DNA of millions of people. The implications are staggering. If you carry Central Asian ancestry, if you have genetic markers from the Mongol Empire, if your DNA shows signatures from the Middle East or Eastern Europe or Central Asia, you might be a descendant of Genghis Khan. You might be a descendant of one of his relatives. You might be a descendant of one of the women who was forced into sexual relations with a Mongol conqueror. And the genetic evidence doesn't lie. It doesn't get filtered through political narratives or official histories. It doesn't get suppressed by governments or minimized by academics. It just exists. It persists. It's carried in the bodies of millions of people. It's a silent testament to events that happened centuries ago. What makes this particularly disturbing is that for most of history, this practice wasn't even acknowledged as particularly unusual. Conquest and rape went together. It was expected. It was assumed. It was how wars worked. The victors took the women of the vanquished. It was treated as a natural consequence of defeat, as a spoil of war, as a right that came with military victory. The Mongols didn't invent this practice. Sexual violence as a weapon of war and conquest existed long before them. It existed in countless other military campaigns. It existed in every empire that conquered other peoples. It was a constant feature of warfare and conquest throughout human history. But the Mongols systematized it in a way that was unprecedented. They made it official policy. They organized it. They tracked it. They ensured that the children born from these encounters were acknowledged as part of the Khan's lineage. The historical records suggest that Genghis Khan himself fathered somewhere between hundreds and thousands of children. He had multiple wives and countless concubines. Women were constantly brought to him from conquered cities, and he fathered children with all of them. His sons and grandsons followed the same pattern. They had multiple wives. They took conquered women as concubines. They fathered children with them. One particularly disturbing historical account describes the selection process. When a city was conquered, particularly if it had resisted, the most beautiful unmarried women would be selected. They would be examined by the Khan's officials. They would be judged on their appearance, their health, their potential for bearing children. The ones deemed most suitable would be taken to the Khan. The ones deemed less suitable might be given to officers or soldiers. The ones deemed unsuitable might be enslaved or simply killed. The women who were selected had no choice. They had no voice. They couldn't refuse. If they tried to resist, they would be punished. If they tried to escape, they would be hunted down. They were property. They were resources. They were vehicles for the Khan's genetic legacy. And the children born from these encounters grew up in a complex position. Some were acknowledged as part of the Khan's family and given positions of authority. Others were acknowledged but given lesser positions. Still others might not have been acknowledged at all, left to grow up in their mother's community. But the genetic reality remained. The bloodline persisted. The genetic signature was passed down. What the DNA evidence has made clear is the scale of this practice. The genetic signature is so common, appears in such high frequencies, that it can only be explained by systematic reproduction across centuries, by generation after generation of Khans taking conquered women, by enormous numbers of children being produced from these encounters, by the genetic legacy being passed down to descendants who are alive today. Modern geneticists have estimated that approximately 16 million men alive today carry the genetic signature attributed to Genghis Khan and his immediate male relatives. 16 million men. That's roughly 0.5% of the global male population. That's an extraordinary number. That represents a level of genetic legacy that only a handful of men in all of history have achieved. But what's often glossed over in the scientific literature is what this genetic legacy represents. It represents rape on an industrial scale. It represents the systematic sexual violence inflicted on millions of women across centuries. It represents the conquest of populations through the forced reproduction of conquerors with conquered women. It represents the way that military victory was consolidated through sexual domination. The practice of the rite of the first night eventually faded out. As empires became more centralized and more formal in their governance, as written laws replaced customary practices, as the world became more interconnected and international norms began to develop, the systematic practice of taking conquered women declined. But it took centuries. It took changes in warfare. It took changes in governance. It took changes in how empires were structured. And even as the formal practice declined, the genetic legacy remained. The genetic signature persisted. It was passed down through generations. It became embedded in the genetic makeup of hundreds of millions of people. It became a permanent record of what had happened. A record written not in documents or histories, but in DNA. What the genetic evidence makes abundantly clear is that the conquest wasn't just political or military. It was biological. It was genetic. It was written into the very substance of the conquered populations. The conquerors literally merged their genetic legacy with the conquered peoples. They ensured that future generations would carry the blood of both the conquerors and the conquered. They ensured that the genetic dominance would persist even after political dominance might fade. The discovery of this genetic signature has had surprising implications. It's forced a reckoning with histories that had been minimized or glossed over. It's made it impossible to ignore the scale of sexual violence that occurred. It's made it clear that this wasn't just a curiosity of history. This wasn't just an interesting archaeological fact. This was a fundamental aspect of how conquest worked. This was how empires were actually built and maintained. But the genetic evidence tells us something else as well. It tells us that despite the best efforts of the Khans to control outcomes, to control who they mated with, to ensure genetic legacy, the conquered peoples persisted. The women survived. They bore children. Those children grew up. They had children of their own. The genetic line continued. And now, centuries later, millions of people carry the genetic legacy of both the conqueror and the conquered in their bodies. The genetic signature isn't just evidence of conquest. It's evidence of survival. It's evidence that despite the violence and the domination, the conquered peoples persisted. Their genetic material persisted. Their descendants survived. And now that genetic material is mixed with the genetic material of the conquerors in millions of bodies across the world. But the story of genetic legacy and conquest doesn't end with the Mongols. Throughout history, conquests have left genetic fingerprints. Empires have left genetic signatures. And now, with modern DNA analysis, we're discovering that the genetic maps of human populations tell stories of conquest and sexual violence that traditional histories have often overlooked or minimized. There are other stories embedded in human DNA. Stories of empires and conquests. Stories of forced reproduction. Stories of the way that genetic legacy is used to maintain power and control. Stories that are just beginning to be told as we develop the technology to read them. In our next video, we're going to explore a different kind of genetic legacy. We're going to investigate the hidden histories of royal families and how they maintain genetic purity and control. We're going to examine the methods they used to ensure that the genetic line passed only to those they deemed worthy. We're going to look at the DNA evidence that reveals conspiracies and cover-ups involving the very bloodlines we thought we knew. We're going to discover that some of history's greatest mysteries can be solved through genetic analysis. If the discovery that millions of people alive today are genetic descendants of Genghis Khan unsettled you, If it changed how you think about conquest and genetic legacy, wait until you see what comes next. Because there are genetic stories embedded in the DNA of royal families that are even more shocking. Genetic stories that have been carefully hidden. Genetic stories that reveal the true nature of power and how it's maintained through bloodlines. Subscribe right now. Turn on notifications. Because next week, we're investigating the genetic secrets of history's most powerful families. And what we discover will show you that DNA doesn't lie. That genetic evidence reveals truths that official histories have tried to hide. That the bloodlines of power are far more complex and far more shocking than we've ever been told. Thank you for watching Shadow of Empires. If the genetic evidence of Genghis Khan's reproductive legacy disturbed you, if it changed how you understand conquest and genetic inheritance, hit like, subscribe, and comment telling us which historical secret you want revealed through genetic analysis. Because history is written not just in documents and monuments, it's written in DNA. And modern science is finally allowing us to read that history, to understand what really happened, to acknowledge the truth that official narratives have tried to hide. We'll see you in the next one.